The late autumn chill in suburban Boston was a quiet thing. It wasn't the kind of cold that bit you to the bone, but it was sharp enough to creep up the sleeves of your coat and settle deep within your heart. In an atmosphere tinged with the fading scent of wood smoke and damp leaves, I stood in my in-laws' kitchen, watching a pot of kale soup simmer, never imagining that the very home I had worked so hard to preserve would become the coldest place on earth. My name is Sarah Davis, and I was 34 years old that year. If I hadn't gotten married, I might have still been in a laboratory or on a construction site, a blueprint in my hand, my eyes scanning material specifications as if they were a familiar language. I was once a structural engineer with a good education and a respectable position, but since marrying Michael Harrison, I had stepped back. Outsiders often said I was lucky, with a capable husband from a well-off family, never having to worry about finances. Only those living within these walls understood that what they called luck was actually being placed in a perfectly sized frame, with the unspoken rule that you must never step outside of it. My in-laws lived on a spacious cul-de-sac, where a 7-seater SUV could pull right up to the door. Their 4-story colonial was over a decade old, its facade clad in light-colored stone. The inside always smelled of floor polish and the faint, pleasant scent of potpourri in the entryway. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, was a woman who prized decorum above all else. She was always impeccably dressed, her dark brown hair perfectly coiffed. She spoke with a measured grace, especially in front of relatives. Anyone who met her would praise her good fortune, having 2 successful sons. She adored the compliment, but would always add, as if pulling a line from a well-rehearsed script, that it was thanks to the family's good upbringing, and of course, her daughters-in-law knew their place, which kept the home peaceful. Hearing it, one might think it was a compliment, but I understood that in her eyes, knowing your place meant yielding to your husband, swallowing your unhappiness, smiling at the right time, and staying silent in the right moments. To put it bluntly, a good daughter-in-law was one who never stirred the waters. My husband, Michael, 3 years my senior, was the CEO of the family's company, Apex Materials. He was tall, spoke with a calm, deliberate tone, and carried an air of authority in public. Men like him were easy to trust, they weren't loud, they weren't crude, and they would never raise their voice in public. When we were dating, I thought I had found a mature, responsible partner. He had once said things that melted the heart of an orphaned girl like me. "Just relax, you have me now." It was a short sentence, but I believed it for years. His younger brother, Kevin, was 4 years his junior and worked as the head of procurement at the company. Kevin was hot-tempered, easily offended, and constantly compared to his older brother, which left him with a perpetual chip on his shoulder. Kevin's wife was Chloe, a few years younger than me, fair-skinned and silver-tongued. Whenever relatives were over, she smiled as brightly as a flower. She called me Sarah with a sweetness that could rival honey. But between women, some things are felt without ever being said. Whenever Eleanor praised me in front of others, Chloe's eyes would darken for a split second before her bright smile returned. That evening, as usual, the whole family gathered for dinner. I set the table with pot roast, kale and sausage soup, cornbread, and a platter of cold cuts, adding a small bowl of pickles that Eleanor particularly liked. She sat down, surveyed the spread, and nodded in approval. Sarah has a knack for keeping things organized. That's what sets a woman apart in the home. Chloe laughed, placing a slice of roast on her husband's plate. "Mom, you praise her so much, I'm getting used to hearing it." Eleanor gave Chloe a half smile. "Well, when praise is due, it should be heard. You could learn a thing or two from your sister-in-law instead of making a show of everything you do." The atmosphere at the table froze for a moment. Chloe put down her fork, smiling with her mouth but not her eyes. "You're right, Mom. I'm still young and have a lot to learn." Kevin frowned. "Mom, just eat. Stop lecturing." Eleanor shot her younger son a look. "Was I wrong? If someone makes a mistake, they need to be told. This isn't a free-for-all." I quietly ladled more soup into my mother-in-law's bowl. The role of a daughter-in-law in this family was often like that of a cushion. Everyone could lean on it and find comfort, but no one ever asked if the cushion itself was getting worn down or compressed. Michael sat next to me, saying very little throughout the meal. He ate slowly, his eyes occasionally glancing at his phone, which lay face down beside his hand. I asked him if he wanted more bread. He answered curtly, "No, I'm good." The words were light, not harsh, but between a husband and wife, it's not always the heavy words that inflict pain. It's the bland indifference, like lukewarm water, that makes you shiver. He wasn't always like this. He used to tell me about work, ask my opinion on paint colors for the living room, and even pause on his way through the kitchen to help me snap green beans. laughing as he said it was a waste for an engineer like me to be doing this. Now, he walked past me as if I were a familiar piece of furniture still there, still used daily, but no longer noticed. After dinner, I stood up to clear the table. Eleanor went to her room to watch her favorite primetime drama, Kevin went outside to smoke, and Chloe sat scrolling through her phone, admiring her reflection in the dark screen. I carried the stack of dishes to the kitchen, the water running from the faucet. When I turned back, I saw Michael standing on the first-floor balcony with his phone. He was speaking very softly, almost whispering, his back to the house, one hand in his pocket, the other holding the phone to his ear. I couldn't hear who was on the other end, but I saw a softness in his shoulders that he no longer reserved for me. They say women are intuitive. I don't think it's intuition, it's that we live by observation. A different kind of sigh, a rushed meal, an averted gaze, they all speak volumes. I stood motionless by the kitchen doorway, my hands still damp. The late autumn wind swept through the hallway, making the hair on my arms stand up. Michael's back was still to me, his voice low and quick, as if he were afraid of being overheard. The moment was brief, but for some reason, I felt as if I were watching a door silently close within my own home. The next morning, the Boston wind had picked up. It was just after 6, but I could already hear the scrape of a neighbor's rake on the pavement and the rumble of the first commuter cars starting up. I woke up before everyone else, as I always did, slipped on a thin sweater, and went down to the kitchen to cook oatmeal. I boiled a few eggs and brewed a pot of strong black tea for my mother-in-law. These tasks had become second nature. I did them without thinking. To an outsider, a morning like this would seem orderly and peaceful. My mother-in-law had her hot tea, my husband his pressed shirts, and my brother-in-law a packed lunch for work. Only I knew that orderliness was not the same as peace. Sometimes, it was just a carefully drawn curtain, hiding the seams that were coming undone. I put the oatmeal on the stove, my mind drifting back to the first few years of our marriage. Michael wasn't so cold then. On some winter mornings, he would wake up before me, make me a cup of hot chocolate, and whisper for me to get up before I was late. On nights when I stayed up late, helping him with a technical proposal, he would massage my shoulders and say that marrying me was the smartest thing he ever did. I believed him. I believed him so much that when he said the family business was expanding and he needed someone he trusted to manage the home front so he could focus on work, I agreed without a second thought. I quit my job less than 2 years after we were married. The day I submitted my resignation, my boss asked if I was sure, saying it was a waste for someone with my skills to leave the field. I had smiled and said that at some point, a woman has to choose her priorities. Looking back now, I realize life doesn't always force you to choose between a career and a family. Sometimes, you voluntarily give up a part of yourself, and then people get used to your sacrifice, treating it as a given. Michael still told people that his wife was brilliant and that he wouldn't be where he was today without her support. The words sounded respectful, but as time went on, they felt more like a decorative plaque on a wall than genuine recognition. If he truly understood my value, he wouldn't have let me live like a shadow in my own house. Around 7, Eleanor came downstairs. She was wearing a brown silk robe, her hair neatly combed back. As she sat at the table, she asked if Michael was awake yet. I placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of her. "He's getting dressed upstairs. He should be down soon, Mom." She took a sip of tea and clicked her tongue softly. Men deal with 100 things out there. When they come home, all they want is a hot meal and a gentle voice. A woman's worth is in her ability to keep the peace at home. Remember that, dear. I forced a polite smile. "Yes, Mom. I know." She studied me for a moment, then lowered her voice. "Honestly, Michael has seemed stressed lately. The pressure at work, probably. As a wife, you should try to be a bit softer. If you're too rigid, the string can easily snap." Hearing that, a bitter taste filled my mouth. In all my years as a daughter-in-law, I had never argued with my husband at the dinner table or spoken a single disrespectful word to her. If that was still not soft enough, then perhaps the ideal wife, in many people's eyes, was a woman without feelings. A little later, Kevin and Chloe came down. Chloe was wearing a cream-colored sweater dress and was already checking her lipstick in her phone's reflection. Eleanor saw this and frowned. "You're just having breakfast at home, not going to a gala." Chloe smiled sweetly. "I was just touching it up, Mom. A woman should always look presentable when she leaves the house." Eleanor made a comment that was half joking, half serious. Presentable is one thing. In a marriage, character is more important than looks. Kevin grunted at his mother's words and pulled out his chair with a thud. "Mom, do you have to start with the lectures every single morning?" Eleanor glared at him. I was talking to your wife, not you. Why are you so defensive? Chloe pouted ever so slightly, a gesture she thought was subtle, but I still saw it. This house was like that, words were never direct. They were coded in politeness, but the sharp tip of the needle was always hidden inside. Michael was the last to come down. He was wearing a light blue dress shirt, his tie in his hand, looking as dapper as ever. But as soon as he sat at the table, he reached for his phone. I served him his oatmeal and asked if he wanted an egg. He didn't look at me, his eyes glued to the screen. I don't need one, thanks. I put the bowl down and sat across from him, feeling more like I was speaking to a distant colleague than my own husband. He used to ask me what my plans were for the day, if I was tired, or if his mother was being difficult. Lately, the conversations between us had grown shorter and shorter, like a rope being cut, piece by piece. Some days, an entire evening's exchange consisted of a few phrases. Have you eaten? Yes. You're home late? Yeah. You can go to sleep first. Okay. People say marriage is a lifelong bond, but some marriages don't fail because of physical abuse or blatant betrayal. They erode silently, eaten away by an insidious quiet. That afternoon, I was cleaning out our closet. As I was refolding some of Michael's dress shirts, I detected a faint, unfamiliar perfume on one of the collars. It wasn't a heavy or cheap scent, it was light and elegant. It certainly wasn't the one I wore. I held the shirt for a moment longer than necessary, a bitter smile on my face. It's strange how a woman's mind works. Sometimes, with no concrete proof, just a single hair of a different color or an unfamiliar scent is enough to shatter her world. That evening, I went to the market to buy some chicken and fresh herbs for a simple soup. As I was picking out vegetables, my phone rang. It was Eleanor, reminding me to come home early because relatives were visiting. I rushed home and started preparing everything. The work was a whirlwind of washing vegetables, chopping chicken, wiping down tables, and brewing tea. Being busy helped me not to think, but in every quiet moment, my mind returned to that unsettling feeling. That night, the relatives came and went. Michael played his part perfectly, making pleasant conversation, pouring drinks for his aunt and uncle, laughing at the right moments, and asking the right questions. Looking at him, who would believe that an invisible wall was growing thicker between us every day? Some men are masters not at making money, but at making the world believe they are decent people. Later, I went up to our room first. Outside the window, the wind rustled the branches of the bougainvillea. I sat at my vanity, took the clip out of my hair, and looked at myself in the mirror. At 34, my face wasn't old, just a little tired and lacking vitality. I wondered when I had stopped expecting my husband to look at me like a woman anymore. Michael came into the room later, placed his phone on the nightstand, and went to take a shower. As he set the phone down, the screen lit up for a split second. I only caught a glimpse of a text message preview. There was no full name, just a letter and some numbers. The message was brief. Tomorrow, same as usual. Before I could see more, he turned around, a towel in his hand, drying his hair. He saw me sitting there and picked up his phone with a speed that was almost too natural. It was the kind of naturalness that comes from practice, and that's what hurt the most. I asked, my voice intentionally steady, "Who's texting so late?" He pulled back the covers and lay down on his side of the bed. "Someone from the warehouse, asking about tomorrow's shipment. You should sleep. Don't overthink things." I turned off the light and lay down next to him. The space between us was only an arm's length, but it felt as wide as the street outside. He turned his back to me, his breathing evening out. I lay there with my eyes wide open, staring into the darkness, wondering how long a woman had to be silent before she was allowed to trust her own feelings. In that room, with our shared blanket and a bed big enough for two, I suddenly felt like I was lying next to a winter that had arrived long before the season outside. The next morning, I didn't mention the late-night text. It wasn't because I had forgotten, but because I wanted to look closer, to see what the man sleeping next to me was hiding. In life, if you want to know how murky the river is, you can't just stand on the bank and complain. You have to reach down and touch the mud at the bottom. Michael left for work as usual. Before heading out, he adjusted his collar in the mirror, spritzed on a light cologne, and turned to me with a reminder. "I won't be home for lunch, so you don't have to wait for me." I stood by the shoe cabinet, handing him his blazer, and asked softly, "Is work really busy these days?" He took the jacket, his voice even. "It's the end of the year, contracts are piling up. You just need to take care of Mom and the house." There was nothing wrong with the words themselves, but the way he unconsciously divided our lives, him outside handling big things, me at home handling small things, made my heart sting. I had stood on construction sites, I had read blueprints, I had debated with him over material ratios. Yet, after just a few years at home, all my knowledge, in his eyes, seemed to be reduced to 2 words: the house. After everyone had left, the house felt cavernously empty. I tidied up, changed the bed sheets, dusted the entryway table, and then went to the kitchen to prep a beef stew for dinner. The smell of rosemary and simmering broth filled the kitchen, reminding me of our newlywed days in a small rented apartment. We didn't have much money then, but every evening after work, I would eagerly stop by the market to buy vegetables, thinking about what I could cook to make him happy. It's strange how life works. Sometimes, you have warmth when you have little, and coldness when you have plenty. Around 4 p.m., Michael came home unexpectedly early. The sound of his car in the driveway startled me. He walked in, his leather briefcase in hand, and said quickly, "I have to meet a client from Chicago tonight, to finalize an urgent order. I'm just changing my shirt and heading back out." I glanced at the clock, then at him. "It's rare for you to be home this early." He gave a clipped laugh and a brief reply. "The meeting's late, so I thought I'd pop in." With that, he went straight upstairs, leaving his briefcase on the living room sofa. I knew that briefcase too well. I had often retrieved files, pens, and even tucked a small bottle of headache medicine into the side pocket for him. It was an object so familiar that no one would ever suspect it could one day reveal a hidden truth. Upstairs, the shower started running. I casually brought the briefcase to the table, intending to find the supply contract he mentioned the other day, the one he said needed a few figures double-checked. It had been my habit for years, taking care of these small tasks for him, so he wouldn't have to bother. After all, when a woman is used to caring for someone, she often continues to care, even through the pain. I opened the main compartment. Inside were his laptop, a folder of documents, a black leather-bound notebook, and a box of business cards. Everything was as neat and organized as his public persona. I flipped through the paper's price quotes, a shipping schedule, a few expense receipts, but not what I was looking for. I reached for the zippered side pocket. The zipper wasn't fully closed, leaving an opening about the width of 2 fingers. Just a tiny gap. I pulled the zipper open further. Inside, there was a small pack of tissues, an unfinished packet of antacids, and a small object tucked into the corner. My fingertips touched it before my mind could even name it. When I pulled it out, I saw it clearly, a new tube of personal lubricant, so new that the plastic seal around the cap was barely scuffed. I froze. The entire room seemed to have been sucked dry of sound. The water was still running upstairs, cars were still passing by outside, and the stew was probably still simmering on the stove, but my mind was a thick, silent blank. I stared at the object in my hand, feeling as if I had mistakenly picked up something belonging to a stranger. In 5 years of marriage, Michael and I had never used this. We had our months of normal intimacy, like any other couple. Then it faded, becoming less frequent, then cooler. But never, not once, had an item like this appeared in our home. My hands turned ice cold. I placed the tube on the table, then picked it up again, as if to confirm I wasn't seeing things. The label was printed in English, a small drugstore price tag, still on the bottom. This wasn't something you get as a free sample. It was something bought for a purpose, with clear intent. And that purpose was not part of this marriage. All the scattered fragments of doubt from the past few months suddenly connected into a single, cold, straight line. The late nights, the flashing text messages, the strange perfume on his collar, the way he turned his back to take a call, the detached touches in bed, they were no longer the paranoid suspicions of an insecure wife. They were clues, small pebbles marking the path he had silently taken, walking away from me, I don't know for how long. I didn't cry immediately. It's strange, a pain that immense doesn't always make you burst into tears. It numbs you, as if all the blood has been drained from your body. I sat down on the edge of the sofa, looking at the half-open briefcase, my heart pounding so hard it hurt my chest. For a fleeting second, I even tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was mistaken, maybe someone asked him to hold it for them. Maybe. But before I could finish deceiving myself, the thought seemed ridiculous. A man hiding such an object in the side pocket of the briefcase he carries every day, and leaving it so carelessly? It wasn't an accident. It was because he had grown so accustomed to my trust that he had dropped his guard. It's true, women often lose not because they are foolish, but because they love so much they willingly blind themselves. Upstairs, the bathroom door opened. I flinched, quickly placing the tube back in its exact spot in the corner and pulling the zipper almost completely shut, just as it was before. My hands were shaking so much I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. Just as I closed the briefcase, Michael came downstairs. He had changed into a charcoal gray shirt, his hair still slightly damp, the faint scent of aftershave in the air. He saw me standing by the table and asked casually, "Were you looking for something in my briefcase?" I turned, trying to keep my face neutral. "I was looking for that price quote you mentioned the other day." He walked over and picked up the briefcase. "Don't worry about it. I'm meeting them tonight, I'll just ask them directly." I looked up at my husband. In that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing before a man who was both a stranger and intimately familiar. The face, the voice, the posture, everything was the same. Only the trust inside me had just plummeted into a bottomless well. I nodded. "Okay, then you should go." He looked at me for a second longer, perhaps noticing the hoarseness in my voice, but then he just took his briefcase and walked towards the stairs, leaving behind a scent of clean cologne that was acridly bitter. I stood alone in the living room. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows of the table legs across the tiled floor. Outside, I could hear children in the neighborhood calling out to each other. It was a perfectly normal afternoon in the suburbs, for everyone else. Only inside of me, something had just shattered with a silent crack, unheard by anyone, but loud enough to throw the world I had carefully maintained completely off its axis. Michael went upstairs to get his watch, and I remained rooted to the spot in the living room. I couldn't hear him opening a drawer, spraying more cologne, or changing his shoes. My ears felt as if they were stuffed with thick cotton. All I could see in my mind's eye was that tube of lubricant, nestled in his briefcase like a confession that needed no words. I walked into the kitchen in a daze. On the shelf near the sink, next to a roll of plastic wrap and a sewing kit, was the tube of superglue I used for small household repairs. It was normally an item so trivial no one would notice it, but that day, my eyes landed right on it. I picked it up, my hand ice cold. Two voices whirred in my head. One told me to put it down, not to do something foolish. The other hissed, bitter, and distorted. "He takes that to go have fun with another woman while you stand here cooking, making tea, and making the bed like a puppet. There are moments when a woman's self-respect is trampled, and that pain is sharper than any heartbreak." I returned to the living room and opened the side pocket of the briefcase again. The sound of the zipper made my heart hammer against my ribs. I picked up the tube and unscrewed the cap, my fingertips trembling so much I almost dropped both items on the floor. Then, as if pushed by a simultaneous wave of heat and cold, I squeezed a small amount of the superglue into the tube and shook it gently. The action was swift, but to me, it felt like an eternity. When I was done, I took a tissue, wiped the opening clean, screwed the cap back on, and placed it exactly where I had found it. I even zipped the pocket to the same point as before, adjusting the edge of the tissue packet to peek out just so, as if nothing had ever been touched. The meticulousness of my own actions startled me. It turns out that when pushed to the edge of a cliff, a person can be frighteningly calm. I had just placed the briefcase back on the sofa when Michael came downstairs. He glanced at me, his tone casual. "You can start setting the table. I'll eat a few bites before I go." I went into the kitchen without a word. The beef stew was still on the stove, the scent of herbs and roasted meat rising from the pot. I ladled the soup into a bowl, set out a plate of pickles, and placed the silverware neatly in parallel. Everything was in its proper place, just like any other evening. Only the person setting the table was no longer the same. Michael sat down, scrolling through his phone while he waited for me to serve the food. I placed the bowl in front of him. He ate a few mouthfuls, then said, "This client from Chicago is a bit difficult. I'll probably be home late, so you can go to bed first." I looked at him, longer than usual this time. It wasn't an accusatory or a pleading gaze, just a look deep enough for me to recognize how far the man in front of me had drifted away. Perhaps that's why he paused slightly before asking, "Why are you looking at me like that?" I gave a faint, bitter smile. "It's nothing. I was just thinking that a truly busy person always has a reason." He frowned but didn't press further. Men are strange. They are adept at hiding themselves, but slow to realize when someone else has seen right through them. Michael bent his head and continued to eat, with the same deliberate posture, the same steel watch on his wrist, the same clean, respectable shirt. An outsider walking in would see a model husband, finishing a home-cooked meal before rushing off to handle business. It's true, the scariest thing in the world isn't an obvious villain, but a bad person who knows how to wear a respectable suit. After eating, he stood up, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and picked up his briefcase. Before leaving, he turned and said, as he always did, "Make sure you lock the door." I replied, "Okay." The door closed softly behind him, but in my ears, the sound was as heavy as a boulder. The house suddenly felt eerily spacious. Eleanor was already in her room watching television. Kevin wasn't home yet, and Chloe had texted the family group chat that she was going to a friend's house. I sat alone in the living room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of cars on the street, and the ticking of the clock, which was so loud it was unnerving. All the normal sounds of a quiet evening had become a form of torture. I picked up my phone and put it down countless times. One moment I wanted to call Michael and scream at him, demanding to know who the other woman was. The next, I wanted to storm out of the house, follow him, and catch him red-handed so there would be no room for denial. But in the end, I sat still. Not out of forgiveness, but because a strange feeling was brewing inside me, a mixture of twisted satisfaction and suffocating anxiety. At a little after 9, I called him. The phone rang for a long time, but no one answered. I sent a short text, "Are you done with work?" The message was delivered, but the other end remained silent. By 11, I was pacing from the living room to our bedroom and back. I made a cup of hot water and left it untouched. I turned on the TV and then turned it off. I felt like I was on fire inside, yet my hands and feet were ice cold. Around 2 a.m., when the street outside had fallen quiet, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. The moment I answered, a woman's urgent voice came through the line. "Are you related to a Michael Harrison? We're calling from Massachusetts General Hospital. He's in the emergency room with another woman in a delicate situation. Can you come here immediately?" I went numb. A wave of icy water seemed to pour down my spine, and the phone nearly slipped from my grasp. In that instant, I knew that after this night, there would be no going back to the way things were. I don't remember how I managed to put on a coat, slip on my shoes, and grab my purse. Everything happened so fast that my mind couldn't process it. All I knew was that as I ran out of the house, the late autumn night air hit my face like a slap, and my hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped the car keys. The streets of suburban Boston were nearly deserted at 2 a.m. The yellow streetlights cast long, lonely streaks on the pavement. Occasionally, a semi-truck would roar past. I drove with my heart pounding erratically, a tight knot in my stomach. The words of the woman from the hospital echoed in my head, in the emergency room with another woman in a delicate situation. Just a few words, but they were enough to bring all my darkest premonitions to life. I didn't know what I was more afraid of. That something had happened to Michael, or who the other woman was. When I arrived at the hospital, I parked haphazardly and ran straight to the emergency department. The hallway, even in the middle of the night, was blindingly white. The sharp scent of antiseptic stung my nostrils. The hurried footsteps of nurses, the rattle of gurneys, the anxious questions of family members, the overhead speaker calling for doctors, it all blended into a chaotic, headache-inducing sound. I stopped for a moment, my eyes darting between the signs and the rows of cold plastic chairs. A nurse walked by, and I quickly grabbed her arm. "Excuse me, can you tell me where Michael Harrison is? I'm his family." She glanced at me and then asked, "Are you family for Mr. Harrison, or for the woman?" I replied quickly, "I'm his wife." At those words, the nurse's expression shifted ever so slightly, as if in that 1 second, she understood the whole awkward, painful scene before her. She pointed down the hall. "He's in the procedure room over there. The doctor is with them now. Please wait outside." I walked as if in a trance, my feet barely touching the linoleum floor. As I neared the door, I overheard someone inside say in a low voice, "This one's tough, it's a strong reaction." Then another voice cut in, "I told you to keep the family outside." I stood frozen, my fingers digging into the strap of my purse. The delicate situation from the phone call was now becoming terrifyingly clear, even without anyone explaining it. Just then, another nurse hurried past, a stack of files in her arms. The top sheet was askew, revealing a few lines of bold print. I caught only a glimpse of the name of the female patient who was with Michael, Chloe Harrison. I couldn't breathe. My body felt as if it had been nailed to the floor. For a few seconds, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked repeatedly, watching the stack of files move further down the hall, but the name was already seared into my brain. Chloe Harrison. Kevin's wife. My sister-in-law. It wasn't some random woman from outside. It wasn't a secretary or a client. It wasn't a stranger's name that I could curse at to vent my anger. It was the woman who called me Sarah every day with that syrupy sweet voice. It's true what they say, sometimes life hits you with a blow you never see coming. I took a step back, my back hitting the cold wall. The feeling wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was like someone had thrown a heap of garbage onto the family's pristine dining table. The shame was so intense, it made my tongue go numb. Before I could compose myself, I heard hurried footsteps from the end of the hall. Kevin came running, his jacket on crooked, his hair a mess, his face drained of all color. The moment he saw me, he rushed over, his words tumbling out. "Sarah, where's Chloe? The hospital called and said she was in the ER. Why is Michael here too?" I opened my mouth, but my throat was tight. I had never found it so hard to answer a simple question. I looked at Kevin, at his genuine panic, and a bitter feeling washed over me. It turned out I wasn't the only one in this family who had been deceived. As I stood there speechless, the door to the procedure room swung open. A doctor stepped out, pulling down his mask. "Where is the family of the two patients?" Kevin and I both stepped forward. The doctor looked at us, his gaze lingering for a moment before he asked, "What is your relationship to them?" Kevin answered first. "I'm Chloe Harrison's husband." I had to force the words out of my own throat. "I'm Michael Harrison's wife." The doctor paused, just for a fraction of a second. That brief hesitation was more humiliating than any scolding. He maintained his professional tone. "The patients are not in life-threatening danger, but the area of contact has been severely damaged due to an adverse reaction to an unknown substance. We are treating it and will need to monitor them." He was speaking clinically, but any adult could understand what he was implying. Kevin stumbled, leaning against the wall for support. His lips trembled, and his eyes widened in disbelief. I stood there, my feet feeling like they were rooted to the floor. The tube of lubricant in the briefcase hadn't just been for a simple affair, it had been for an incestuous one, right within the family. Less than 10 minutes later, Eleanor arrived. She had hastily thrown on a dark sweater, her house slippers still on her feet, her hair pulled back messily. She was out of breath. As soon as she got there, she demanded, "Where's Michael? What happened? What's going on?" Kevin turned to her, his mouth opening and closing, unable to form words. Before I could say anything, a gurney was wheeled out from the room. The person on it was Michael. His face was pale, his eyes shut tight, his jaw clenched, and his forehead beaded with sweat. Just looking at him, you could tell he was in excruciating pain. A second gurney followed. Chloe was lying on her side, her hair stuck to her tear-streaked face. At that moment, Kevin seemed to snap. He lunged forward, his voice a raw croak. "Chloe, why are you here? With Michael? What is going on?" Chloe opened her eyes, she saw her husband, then she saw me, and her expression twisted in shame. She turned her face away, avoiding my gaze, but before she could remain silent, Kevin roared even louder. "Say something." In the midst of the chaos, Eleanor turned on me. Perhaps it was the shock, the humiliation, or perhaps, in her mind, the daughter-in-law was always the easiest target. She raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. "What kind of wife are you, to let your husband end up like this?" The sound of the slap echoed sharply in the brightly lit hallway. I staggered back, my cheek burning as if it had been licked by fire. A few people nearby turned to stare. I raised a hand to my cheek, unable to cry. The physical pain was nothing compared to the pain of knowing that in the moment her family's shame was laid bare in a public hospital, she still chose to blame me first. I looked at my mother-in-law, and for the first time, I saw with stark clarity where the scales of justice in this family were tilted. Just then, Chloe blurted out a sentence, her voice trembling but sharp enough to cut. "I'm not the only one at fault. If Michael was truly happy with Sarah, this would never have happened." Her words were like gasoline on a fire. Kevin let out a roar and lunged at Michael's gurney, grabbing the collar of his brother's hospital gown. "You're my own flesh and blood, and you do this to me?" The shift from a wounded sibling to a bitter enemy happened in an instant. Nurses had to rush in to separate them. A doctor yelled for order. Eleanor sank onto a chair, her lips trembling uncontrollably. And I stood in the middle of that ice-cold hallway, suddenly understanding that from this night on, the family that had guarded its reputation like gold was now torn wide open. I left the hospital as dawn was breaking. The Boston sky was a murky gray, like an old cloth draped over the city. Outside the hospital entrance, late-night food stalls were starting to pack up, their pots of soup and coffee steaming in the cold air. The city was preparing for a new day, but I felt as if I had been dragged through a night so long that my very skin felt bruised. When I got home, I didn't go upstairs. I went straight to the kitchen. The dinner from the night before was still on the table, covered by a mesh food dome. The kale soup was cold, a thin layer of solidified fat on its surface. The beef stew had shrunken, its sauce darkened. The chair where Michael had sat was still slightly pushed out from the table, exactly as he had left it. Everything was unchanged. As if time in this kitchen had frozen at the moment, he walked out the door with his briefcase. I sat down in the opposite chair, my hands on my knees. My left cheek still stung from Eleanor's slap. In my mind, the scenes from the hospital played on a loop. Michael's pale face, Chloe's matted hair, Kevin's stunned eyes, the doctor's clinical words that felt like lashes on our family's honor, and the raw sound of the brothers screaming. Thinking about it, my stomach churned. And then, like a slow-motion blade, I remembered my own hands. I remembered clearly how I had unscrewed the cap of the lubricant, how I had squeezed in the glue, how I had wiped the opening clean, and how I had placed it back. A deep chill ran through me. I didn't feel a genuine sense of triumph. It was only then that I realized I wasn't as satisfied as I had thought I would be. I wasn't happy that he was in pain. I wasn't happy that the two traitors were humiliated. What hit me hardest at that moment was fear. Fear that I had done something reckless. Fear that my own hands were involved in another person's pain. Fear that if I continued down this path, I would lose the last shred of my sanity. In life, anger is a fire. If you don't control it, it burns your own house down first. I sat before the cold meal for a long time, not crying. The tears seemed to have dried up somewhere inside me. My throat was parched, and my hands were as cold as if they had been soaked in ice water. Outside, the sky began to brighten. A small sparrow landed on the doorstep and then flew away. The sun was rising, indifferent to the humiliating way my family had shattered during the night. Around 6:30, Eleanor came home. She entered through the side door, her shoulders slumped, the wool scarf around her neck askew. She didn't look at me right away. She gripped the back of a chair and sank into it like someone who had just walked through a hailstorm. I stood up to get her a glass of warm water, but she waved me away. After a moment, she finally spoke, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep and shame. What happened last night cannot, under any circumstances, get out to the relatives. If the neighbors ask, just say Michael had a stomach issue, and Chloe was just there to help take him to the hospital. I turned to look at her. A few years ago, I probably would have nodded immediately, still thinking that no matter what, I had to protect my in-laws' reputation. But now, after that stinging slap in the hospital hallway, hearing her first words be about silencing gossip, I just felt exhausted. I replied slowly, "You might be able to hide it from outsiders, Mom, but how do you hide it from the people inside this house?" Eleanor looked up, her eyes both weary and sharp. "Don't you take that tone with me. This family is in enough chaos. Making a bigger scene won't help anyone." I gave a bitter smile, so bitter I could taste it myself. Last night at the hospital, I was the one who got slapped. I was the one who had to answer when asked which woman my husband was in the ER with. She was silent for a second, then looked away. I was just upset then. But a smart woman knows how to keep her husband. "You're so rigid, it's no wonder he got tired of you." Her words hit me harder than the slap. I looked at this woman, still praised by outsiders for her grace and dignity, and for the first time, I saw the twisted logic that had nurtured the injustice in this family. Her son had not only betrayed his wife but had also slept with his own brother's wife. Yet, the first person she chose to blame was still the daughter-in-law, because the daughter-in-law wasn't soft enough, wasn't clever enough, wasn't good enough at keeping her husband. It's true what they say, the sins of the father are visited upon the son. The imbalances in a family don't just appear out of nowhere. Around 9 that morning, Kevin came home. He burst through the door as if he were breaking into someone else's house. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes were rumpled, and he smelled of alcohol and stale cigarette smoke. When he saw me in the kitchen, he stopped short. The look in his eyes was strange, a mixture of shame, anger, and avoidance. Kevin and I had never been close, but we were still family. Now, we stood before each other like two people who had been stabbed by the same knife, just in different places. He said in a raspy voice, "Sarah." I cut him off, not wanting to delve into it right then. "You should go rest. You look terrible." Kevin clenched his fists, his jaw tight, and then he punched the doorframe. "I was so stupid, Sarah. I was a damn fool." From the living room, Eleanor's voice called out, "Stop it. What's all the noise about?" Kevin spun around, his eyes red with fury. "What peace are you even talking about anymore, Mom? What's left in this house to be peaceful about?" Eleanor shot up from her seat. "Is that any way to talk to your mother?" Kevin let out a harsh, dry laugh, like burning paper. "I lost my wife, I lost my dignity, and I lost my brother. And you're asking me about my tone?" After saying that, he kicked a chair and stormed upstairs. A moment later, I heard his bedroom door slam shut, followed by silence. For the rest of the day, a thick, suffocating silence filled the house. No one had an appetite. I made a thin soup and steamed some vegetables, but I was the only one who managed a few spoonfuls. Eleanor sat in the living room, flinching every time the phone rang, her voice dropping to a whisper as she likely fended off questions from the outside. Kevin locked himself in his room, only coming down in the afternoon to grab a bottle of liquor before retreating again. Chloe sent a single message to the family group chat. "I'm going to my mom's for a few days. No apology, no explanation, no calling me Sarah." Just one line, as cold and impersonal as a low-battery notification, but it was enough to confirm she had removed herself from this family at its most shameful moment. Michael was still at the hospital for observation. In the afternoon, my phone vibrated. His name was on the screen. I stared at it for a long time before answering. His voice on the other end was hoarse and weaker than usual. "Sarah, I need to see you." I asked, my voice as flat as the table. "What for?" He was silent for a few seconds, then said, "We need to talk." I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the yard where a few dry leaves were swirling in the wind. A month ago, just hearing his voice sound so weak might have softened my heart. But after everything that had happened, my heart felt like it was covered in a layer of cold ash. I replied, "We can talk when you get out of the hospital." Michael said urgently, "Sarah, just listen to me this one time." I closed my eyes, then opened them slowly. "I've listened to you for enough years. This time, I'll choose when I want to listen." I hung up. In that moment, I knew I had crossed a line. I wasn't calm enough to forgive, nor clear-headed enough to plan my next move. But I understood one thing very clearly. From now on, if I let my emotions lead me, I would be the biggest loser in this game. To survive, I needed to know the whole truth. Not just about a tube of lubricant in a briefcase, not just about what happened at the hospital, but everything the man I called my husband had hidden from me throughout our life together. 2 days later, Michael was discharged from the hospital. Eleanor told me the news in the morning, her voice carefully casual, as if her son had just recovered from a simple flu and not from an incident so shameful they didn't know where to hide. She even added a reminder. "When he gets home, you talk to your husband properly. Family matters should be dealt with behind closed doors." I didn't respond. For those 2 days, I went about my tasks like a machine, cooking, doing laundry, watering the orchids, changing the water in the vase on the entryway table. The busier my hands were, the less my mind spun. But whenever I sat down, the images from the hospital would replay in my head. I knew I couldn't avoid this conversation forever. Some debts, no matter how distasteful, have to be settled. That afternoon, the weather turned colder, the first real chill of winter seeping through the window frames. Michael came home around 4. He walked more slowly than usual, his face was still pale, and though he tried to stand straight, he looked exhausted. Eleanor rushed to the door, her voice softening. "Come in, son. Are you still in pain?" Michael replied quietly, "It's better now, Mom." I was in the kitchen, hearing every word, but I continued to chop a handful of scallions. He walked into the house, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on me. It was only for a moment, but it was long enough for me to see he was testing my reaction. I didn't look away, nor did I stare. I just put the knife down, washed my hands, and walked to the dining table to pour a glass of water. Eleanor prompted me. "Sarah, give the water to your husband." I pushed the glass towards Michael, my voice flat. "Here." He picked it up, his fingers hesitating for a split second on the glass. After years of marriage, I was all too familiar with his tells. When he was flustered, he tried even harder to appear calm. Dinner that evening was held in a heavy, oppressive silence. Kevin didn't come down to eat, he had been locked in his room all day, with only the occasional, dry sound of a bottle being opened. Eleanor served the food, sighing dramatically. This house was so peaceful, and then suddenly this mess. It's like a disaster fell from the sky. I looked up at her. "This disaster didn't fall from the sky, Mom." Eleanor froze, her face hardening. "What's that supposed to mean?" I put a piece of fish on my plate before speaking. "People are responsible for their own actions. The sky didn't force anyone into the wrong bed." Michael, sitting across from me, slammed his bowl down. "Sarah." I met his gaze. Where was I wrong? No one spoke after that, only the clinking of silverware against porcelain sounded sharper than usual. Eleanor tried to change the subject, asking what I planned to cook the next day, reminding me about an upcoming family memorial. I listened and found it absurd. It was so typical of this family. They believed that as long as there was a meal on the table, a memorial to attend, and proper greetings exchanged, all the filth underneath would somehow stay hidden. But once the trash starts to stink, you can't cover it with a silk cloth and pretend it's a bouquet of flowers. After dinner, Eleanor went to her room earlier than usual. Before she left, she gave me a look, a clear signal that it was time for husband and wife to talk things out. I cleared the dishes and washed them slowly, the cold water running over my hands. When I finished, I walked into the living room. Michael was already there, leaning back on the sofa, his hands clasped, his face prepared for a difficult conversation. He spoke first. "Sit down. I want to talk properly." I sat across from him. Separated by the coffee table a distance not far, but enough for me to see his face clearly without having to smell the dishonesty that lingered in the air. Michael took a deep breath and lowered his voice. "I'm sorry." I didn't respond. He continued. "What happened was my fault. I know you're hurt, I know it's hard for you to accept, but it's really not what you think." I smirked. "Not what I think, or worse than what I think?" He frowned, then forced his tone to soften again. "Sarah, please, just hear me out. My thing with Chloe, it was a moment of weakness. I have no real feelings for her." I laughed out loud. The sound echoed in the quiet living room, as dry and brittle as a breaking twig. "A moment of weakness," I repeated slowly. "A moment of weakness that landed you both in the hospital? A moment of weakness that required hiding things in a briefcase and arranging a time and place? Do you even believe that yourself?" Michael's hands tightened into fists. "You can think whatever you want, but I'm telling you the truth. Chloe was the one who initiated it. She was complaining about her marriage with Kevin, texting me to vent. I just made a mistake, one time." Hearing that, I felt another layer of cold settle over me. It wasn't pain anymore, it was disgust. This man had just slept with his sister-in-law, and now, sitting in front of his wife, he still had the composure to shift the initial blame onto the other woman. He always managed to find the high ground. I asked, "So you just accidentally tripped and fell into a room with her?" Michael snapped, "Don't talk like that." I looked him straight in the eye. "From the night you and she got into bed together, this house has been a circus. I was just the last one to find out." He was silent for a few seconds, then his voice became lower, more tired. "I don't want to lose this family. For all these years, I have cared for you, I have treated you as my wife. If this gets out, Mom won't be able to handle it. Kevin is already losing control, and the company has so many projects right now. If rumors start to spread, everything will fall apart. You know how Mom is. If she collapses, who will pick up the pieces?" I listened to every word and felt a bitter taste in my throat. In the end, this was what he was truly afraid of. His mother's health, his brother's sanity, the company's stability, the public's opinion. It was all about the things surrounding him. And me, the one who was betrayed in my own home, seemed to be just another variable that needed to be placated. I asked very softly, "And what about me? Did you ever think if I could handle it?" Michael looked at me. But his gaze wasn't deep enough to touch my pain. He replied, "I know you're hurt. That's why I'm asking you to give me a chance to fix this." I enunciated each word. "Are you asking for a chance because you care about me? Or because you're afraid of losing the facade of a perfect family that I've spent years maintaining for you?" My question made him flinch. A direct hit always silences people. A moment later, he stood up and moved a little closer. "Sarah, I admit I was wrong. But we've been married for so many years. Are you really going to throw it all away?" I stood up too. "Whether it's thrown away or not, you were the one who broke it first." He said quickly, "It was just one mistake." I stared at him without blinking. A man who makes a mistake knows to come home and bow his head. But you made a mistake and still had time to pack your briefcase, hide your phone, invent a story about a client, and sit down to eat dinner with me as if nothing had happened. That's not a mistake. That's a habit. Just then, Eleanor came down the stairs. She had probably been listening, or perhaps she had grown impatient with the silence. She walked over, her voice firmer than before. "Are you two done talking? Arguing now won't solve anything." I turned to her. "I'm not arguing, Mom. I'm just listening to your son apologize." Eleanor took a sharp breath, then resorted to her old lecture. "A woman's wisdom lies in knowing when to be reasonable. What's done is done. Now you need to focus on mending things. What do you gain by tearing this family apart?" I looked at her, no longer avoiding her gaze. "You ask what I gain? Well, for starters, I won't have to keep serving meals to a traitor." Her face darkened. "You're being disrespectful." Michael tried to intervene. "Mom, stop." I cut him off, my voice even but cold. "I haven't been disrespectful. If I were, I would have said all this that night at the hospital." Eleanor glared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. I knew that from this moment on, in her eyes, I was no longer the docile, obedient daughter-in-law. But strangely, I wasn't afraid. Perhaps because when a person is pushed to the brink, the scariest thing is no longer disappointing others, but continuing to betray oneself. Michael stared at me for a long time. His eyes held a mixture of exhaustion and anxiety, as if he was seeing for the first time that the ever-patient wife before him was no longer standing in her old place. I looked back at him and suddenly understood with complete clarity. This man wasn't in pain because he had hurt me. He was just trying to save everything that belonged to him. Later that night, after we had retreated to our separate rooms, I sat alone on the edge of the bed for a long time. Outside, the wind rustled through the bougainvillea, a dry, papery sound. I was no longer in a state of turmoil like the past few days. The pain was still there, but amidst the chaos, a single thought began to take hold. To know what kind of person you're living with, you can't just listen to what he says. To untangle a knot of lies, you have to start from the very beginning of the thread. And I knew it was time for me to find someone clear-headed, objective, and discreet enough to help me see the entire truth. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. It wasn't from a good night's sleep. I had barely closed my eyes. The early winter sky was a dull gray, and the wind swirled dry leaves around the patio. I put on a sweater and went to the kitchen to boil water, watching the blue flame under the kettle with a sense of calm detachment. After a storm, the most frightening thing isn't the wind, but the dead silence that follows. I was in that silence now. Michael left for work later than usual, still looking tired. Before he left, he looked at me as if he wanted to say something, but I just turned back to the kitchen to cover the pot of oatmeal. Only when the sound of his car had faded did I wipe my hands, go upstairs, change into a long beige coat, tie my hair back neatly, and leave with my purse. I had arranged to meet David Chen at a small coffee shop on a quiet side street. David was an old friend from college, we were in the same engineering program. He was quiet back then but incredibly sharp. I had heard he later went into corporate investigations, specializing in tracing financial records and internal affairs for companies in dispute. We weren't the kind of friends who texted every day, but we were the kind who could go years without seeing each other and still understand one another perfectly. The coffee shop was quiet that morning, the smell of roasted coffee and old wood calming my frayed nerves. David arrived about 10 minutes after me, still tall and lean, wearing thin-rimmed glasses. He looked at me for a moment and said simply, "You've lost weight." I gave a faint smile. "I didn't call you here for that." David sat down, ordered a black coffee, and looked me straight in the eye. "Tell me." I told him the story, concisely, and without embellishment. I didn't meander or add dramatic details to soften the humiliation. I told him about the briefcase, the lubricant, the 2 a.m. phone call, Chloe's name on the hospital file, Eleanor's slap, and Michael's apology. My throat grew drier with every word, but strangely, I didn't break down. I suppose I had already broken enough. David listened in silence, then asked, "Do you want to know about the affair, or do you want to know everything?" I looked out the window at the cars passing under the bare trees. "I want to know everything. Relationships, money, the company, his schedule, anything that can be known, I want to know it." David nodded, tapping his finger on his cup. "All right. But once we start digging, you might find things that are harder to swallow than what you're already dealing with." I held my warm teacup, the steam fogging my glasses. At this point, more bitterness is just more bitterness. Leaving the coffee shop, I went straight to Rob Miller's office on Boylston Street. Rob was a few years older than me, a friend from my college circle who had become a corporate and civil litigator. Rob had a way of being brutally direct, which was grating if you were looking for sympathy, but essential when you needed to see the truth clearly. After hearing my story, he didn't offer a single word of comfort. He pushed up his glasses, opened a small notebook, and said flatly, "The affair just gets you a cleaner divorce. To take down a man like Michael Harrison, you need to hit him where it hurts, the financials." I looked up. "You mean the company?" Rob nodded. "Exactly. Men like him aren't afraid of a wife's tears. They're afraid of paperwork that talks. If it's just about the cheating, he'll find a way to apologize, use his mother, the family, his reputation to pressure you into accepting it. But if you touch his assets, that's when his true face will show." His words were like a key unlocking a door in my mind. For years, I had thought Michael's greatest vulnerability was his pristine family image. But beneath that veneer was something deeper. Money, status, and his position at the head of the company. And I wasn't entirely ignorant about those things. I had worked with him on technical proposals, adjusted specifications for Apex's core product lines. It had just been so long. I had grown so used to stepping back that I had almost forgotten what I knew. Rob closed his notebook and looked at me. First, don't show your hand. Let him think you're still hurting, confused, and slow to react. Second, gather everything you still have, old technical files, patents, emails, any related paperwork. Third, let David trace the people and the money. And remember one thing. From now on, stop acting on your anger. I sat in silence for a few seconds, then nodded. Walking out of the law office, the city wind felt sharp against my face, but my mind was clearer than it had been in days. When I got home, I put on my apron, cooked dinner, poured tea for Eleanor, and listened to her subtle hints about keeping family matters private. I saw Kevin moving like a shadow on the stairs. But inside, I had already shifted my position. Late that afternoon, I went to the small storage room at the back of the house and opened a cardboard box of old files I hadn't touched in years. The smell of old paper, ink, and dry dust was both familiar and strange. I flipped through the documents, the technical proposals, the engineering contracts, my hand tracing over the pages as if reacquainting myself with a part of my life I had left behind. There comes a point when a wife, pushed into a corner, has no choice but to become clear-headed. If it were you, in that situation, would you choose silence for the sake of peace, or would you pull at every loose thread to find out just how deeply you had been deceived? Sometimes the biggest surprise isn't the betrayal itself, but how sharp and focused the betrayed can become. I sat on the floor, surrounded by stacks of old files. Outside, the sky was darkening quickly. For the first time after days of turmoil, I knew I no longer wanted to ask Michael why. I only wanted to know how much filth was hidden under this roof, behind all the respectable words. 3 days after meeting with David and Rob, I received a text from David around noon. It was just 4 words. Afternoon meeting. Got something. I read the message, my hand tightening slightly. A man like David never wasted words. If he said he had something, it was significant. That afternoon, I made an excuse about buying supplements for my mother-in-law and took a cab to a quiet cafe near the Charles River. The early winter sky was overcast, the river a placid gray, and the wind hissed through the bare branches of the trees. I chose a secluded corner table. David arrived with a thin file folder and a black USB drive. He sat down without any small talk and pushed his phone towards me. Look. I picked it up. The screen showed several photos taken from a distance. The first showed Michael getting out of a car in front of a luxury high-rise in the Seaport district. The second showed him walking next to a tall woman in a beige coat, her hair elegantly styled, wearing large sunglasses. In the third, they were entering an elevator together, standing close enough that it was clearly not a professional relationship. I looked closely at the woman, and my heart skipped a beat. Isabella Rossi, I said, my voice hoarse. David nodded. Correct. Apex's chief financial officer. I put the phone down slowly. If Chloe was a slap to the family's honor, Isabella's name was a knife to my self-respect, but in a different way. I knew this woman. Not well, but I knew of her. She was a couple of years older than me, spoke with precision, always smelled of expensive perfume, and carried herself with a cool, sharp efficiency. The few times I had visited the office in the past, Isabella had always been perfectly polite, calling me Mrs. Harrison with just the right amount of deference. By all appearances, she was a woman who valued her image. A bitter smile touched my lips. So my husband has his categories. David raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I looked at the photos again. One for sordid little thrills inside the family, and one for money and prestige on the outside. He really does like to keep things compartmentalized. David didn't comment. He opened the folder and laid out a few printouts of bank transfers and receipts. This apartment is registered to someone else, but the payments for the furniture and service fees for the past few months have come from a secondary account managed by Michael. There are also a few receipts for a watch, a handbag, a spa. Not enough to prove everything, but enough to show this isn't a fling. I picked up the bank statement. The numbers were like ice against my fingertips. 1,800美元, 2,700美元, 4,200美元, 7,500美元. These were sums that a stay-at-home wife like me would have to carefully consider before spending on the entire family. Yet my husband spent them as easily as brushing dust off his sleeve. It's true what they say, where a man's money goes, his heart usually follows. How long? I asked. David replied, based on the paper trail, at least 1.5 years. Maybe longer. I laughed, a thin, cold sound like a razor's edge. 1.5 years. That meant while I was planning family gatherings, caring for my sick mother-in-law, and managing the household, my husband had a whole other world operating in parallel behind my back. I sat in silence for a long time, not crying, not shaking. Perhaps when pain reaches a certain threshold, it stops making you collapse and instead transforms into a strange kind of clarity. I looked out the window at an elderly couple walking hand in hand along the river and thought, with a bitter pang, that a woman's greatest fear isn't that her husband loves someone else more, but the discovery that for a long time, she has only been a backdrop, kept in place to maintain the composition. David pushed my coffee towards me. "You okay?" I replied, "I'm so okay it scares me." Then I asked, "Besides the women, is there anything else?" David held my gaze for a moment, as if making sure I really wanted to hear. Then he spoke slowly. "There are signs Michael's finances aren't clean. It's not definitive yet, but I'm seeing some overlap between his personal and company expenses. I need more time to unravel it." I nodded. Rob Miller's words echoed in my head. The affair is the pretext. The financials are the real target. I realized then that while these photos were painful, they weren't necessarily the most dangerous part of the story. Isabella was not like Chloe, she wasn't the type to lose her head over passion. A woman like her would only stay with a man as long as there were shared interests. I took a sip of the bitter coffee and said, "Keep digging, David. I don't need to know how many women he's betrayed me with anymore. I need to know what bigger things he's hiding from me." David nodded. "Okay. But remember, the calmer you are, the better. The moment Michael senses you know too much, he'll change his tactics." On the ride home, the early winter wind whipped against my face. The city was bustling with traffic, streetlights glowed, and restaurants were beginning to fill up. It was the same familiar Boston, but I was no longer the woman who had left home with a heart full of wavering trust. I moved through the city with a mind that was chillingly clear. Chloe had humiliated me, Isabella had woken me up. And Michael? He was slowly peeling off his own respectable skin, piece by piece. That evening, as I set the dinner table, I overheard Eleanor on the phone with a relative, boasting, "Our family is as peaceful as ever, nothing is wrong." I stood in the kitchen and thought, you can't hide a needle in a haystack forever. The only question is whether it will prick you with a small scratch or a bloody hand. And from that moment on, I was no longer interested in just catching a cheater. I was beginning to see that behind these women, there might be a much deeper abyss waiting for me to look into. The next day, David asked me to meet him at lunchtime. Same cafe, same corner table, but this time his expression was different. It wasn't the cautious look of someone delivering initial findings, it was the look of someone who had uncovered something heavy. As soon as he sat down, he opened his laptop and turned the screen towards me. "Take a look." On the screen was a spreadsheet comparing payments made by Apex Materials. Over the past 2 years, a series of intermediary companies appeared repeatedly: Keystone Logistics, Summit Trading, Sterling Solutions. At a glance, they looked like normal suppliers. But when David scrolled down to the details, I saw a pattern of inflated payments at regular intervals, which were then split into multiple cash transactions. I asked quietly, "Are you sure?" David replied, "Not enough for a criminal case yet, but enough to show signs of embezzlement. Supply contracts with padded prices, goods delivered that don't match the invoices, and money funneled through 3 layers of intermediaries before being withdrawn." The final approver on many of these documents was Michael. The financial sign-off was from Isabella Rossi. I stared at the 2 names. One was my husband, the other was the woman living a parallel life with him in a luxury condo. Now, everything was fitting together in a horrifying way. They weren't just sleeping together, they were feeding at a much larger trough. "What about Kevin?" I asked. David highlighted a few lines on the screen. "Kevin's signature is on some of the delivery receipts and inventory forms. But from what I can see, he looks more like someone signing out of habit than a mastermind. The kind of person who's just pushed a stack of papers and told to sign." I sat in silence. Kevin was hot-headed and insecure, but I never thought he had the depth to orchestrate a sophisticated financial scheme like this. The person capable of this had to be someone with both authority and a talent for deception, with a clean-handed partner by his side. Rob Miller was right. The affair was the pretext, the financials were the real target. Leaving the cafe, I didn't go straight home. I stopped at an office supply store and bought clear file folders, labeling tape, and a marker. I acted like any other woman running errands, but in my mind, a different kind of plan was taking shape. I was no longer asking why he betrayed me. I was beginning to ask a much colder question. How has he been using me all these years? That afternoon, I went back to the storage room and pulled out all the old boxes. Technical files, operational manuals, patent applications, printed emails from the early years when I worked alongside Michael to build the company. They were all covered in dust, but they weren't dead. I sat on the floor, sorting them by year and category. My hands got grimy with paper dust and my nose tingled from the musty smell, but my mind was unusually sharp. I opened a faded blue folder. Inside was the technical manual for the thermal insulating paint that Apex had used to win several major contracts. On the first page, in clear print, were the words, "Lead Developer, Sarah Davis." I froze for a few seconds, then opened a second folder, then a third. An improved waterproofing solution, a material surface stabilization process, a core specifications document that I had stayed up for nights to complete. Some were in my name alone, others were listed as co-developed. But the foundational work had come from me. I remembered Michael's sweet words back then. "Let's keep it in your name for now, it's safer. That way, if there are any external disputes, it's easier to protect." I had believed him, thinking he was being strategic for the company, for our family. Now, sitting amidst these old documents, I finally understood. He was the one who had been playing both sides from the very beginning. He used my intellect to build the company's foundation and then slowly pushed me back into the kitchen, to the point where, years later, even I had gotten used to thinking of myself as just a housewife. The deepest pain isn't being openly robbed of your work, it's being made to forget your own worth. That night at dinner, Michael sat in his usual spot, his shirt crisp, his hair neat, his voice as polite as ever. He asked Eleanor about her upcoming memorial plans, told me to take her for her arthritis checkup, and reminded Kevin to stay on top of the end-of-month shipments. Listening to him, a chill went down my spine. A man who could approve a fraudulent contract in the afternoon could come home in the evening, serve his mother fish, and remind his wife to wear a sweater because it was getting cold. That was the truly terrifying kind. In the middle of the meal, I looked up at Michael and asked very casually, "Do you still have the digital files for the thermal insulating paint specs?" He paused for a fraction of a second. "Why?" I ladled soup into my bowl. "I just wanted to look them over. Being home all the time, I'd like to read up so I don't forget my skills." Michael gave a dismissive smile. "The company is different now, Sarah. You probably wouldn't keep up even if you read them." I put my spoon down and looked him straight in the eye. "Can't keep up, or you don't want me to?" The question made Eleanor and Kevin look up. The atmosphere at the table turned icy. Michael stared at me, his eyes sharp with suspicion for the first time. But I felt strangely calm. They say that after a breakdown, a woman either crumbles or turns to steel. I think I was slowly becoming the latter. That night, I organized all the documents into new folders, carefully labeling each one. On the other side of the bed, Michael was either asleep or pretending to be. I didn't bother to look. Outside, the winter wind rustled the trees, sounding like flipping pages. I gently smoothed the cover of a folder with my name on it and understood with perfect clarity. Tomorrow, I would no longer be standing on the outside of that company. I wouldn't be going as a wife questioning her husband, but as someone who knew exactly where she had put her hands and what in there belonged to her. The next morning, I chose a white silk blouse and a charcoal gray blazer, tying my hair back in a neat bun. I looked at myself in the mirror for a little longer than usual, not to admire my appearance, but to see the face of the woman who was about to walk into her husband's company after years on the sidelines, without the old look of patient endurance. When Eleanor saw me dressed, she asked from her armchair, "Where are you going so early?" I picked up my folder of documents and replied casually, "I'm stopping by the office for a bit." She frowned. "What for?" I bent down to put on my shoes, my voice steady. "To look over some old technical documents. After all, I used to be in charge of that part." Eleanor set her teacup down with a sharp clink. "The company is in a mess right now. Don't go there and make things more complicated." I looked up at her and smiled just enough. "I'm not going to make things complicated. I'm just going to get what's mine." With that, I walked out the door. I could feel her disapproving stare on my back, but strangely, it didn't weigh me down. When you've gone past a certain point of pain, the judgment of others feels as light as the wind on your shoulder. The Apex Materials headquarters was a 4-story glass and steel building on a major road. The blue and silver sign gleamed. I had been here many times before to drop off documents, to join Michael for an internal meeting, or simply to bring him lunch when he was too busy. Back then, everyone greeted me warmly as Mrs. Harrison, but it was always with the implicit understanding that I was just the boss's wife. And I had grown so used to my background role that I never expected them to see me as anything else. Today, walking into the lobby, that feeling was gone. The receptionist looked up, startled. "Mrs. Harrison." I nodded. "Is the finance department upstairs?" She stammered. Yes. But do you have an appointment?" I looked her straight in the eye, my voice low but firm. I don't need one. Please inform Miss Isabella Rossi that I'm here to see her. I waited in the reception area for about 5 minutes. In that short time, I noticed several pairs of eyes peeking out from the glass-walled offices. Someone pretended to get water just to walk past me. Another person froze mid-stride upon recognizing me. I knew that after the hospital incident, no matter how much my in-laws tried to contain it, word had spread among the company's inner circle. Many were probably wondering what the official wife was here to do today. Cry, cause a scene, or beg her husband to come back. The elevator doors opened, and Isabella Rossi stepped out. She was wearing a black pencil skirt and a cream silk blouse, her hair in a low chignon, her lips painted a subtle shade of wine. Her posture was perfect, her perfume elegant and cool, the very image of a woman in control. She looked me up and down, then offered a small, polite smile, the kind that, if you didn't know the truth, would make you think two old acquaintances were reuniting. Mrs. Harrison. You're here early. I stood up. Yes. I need to speak with you. Isabella tilted her head, her voice still smooth. If this is a personal matter, perhaps the office isn't the best place. I met her gaze directly. Don't worry. I'm not here to talk about a man. My words made the smile on her lips fade slightly. She gestured for me to follow her into a small conference room adjacent to the finance department. The glass door closed, leaving just the two of us inside with a long table, a pitcher of water, and a silence that was stretched taut. Isabella sat first, crossing her legs, her hands resting lightly on the table. What did you want to discuss? I didn't sit down right away. I opened my folder and took out 3 sets of documents I had marked, placing them directly in front of her. I'm here to inform you that for the core technological processes of Apex's thermal insulating and waterproofing product lines, the foundational patents are still registered under my name. Isabella glanced at the documents, her eyelashes flickering almost imperceptibly, but she regained her composure quickly. You must be mistaken. The company has been using these assets for years without issue. Our legal files are all in order. I pulled out a chair and sat down, placing my hands on the table. I'm not talking about whether the company is using them. I'm talking about who holds the original legal rights. Isabella picked up the first file. I saw her wrist tense as she reached the page with my name on it. It was only for a second, but it was enough to know my first shot had landed. She put the papers down, a smirk playing on her lips. Personal matters should be handled privately, Mrs. Harrison. The company is very busy right now. I gave a faint smile. I agree. That's why I came here today with documents, not tears. Isabella leaned back in her chair, her eyes turning colder. What do you want? I replied succinctly. I want the company, and the people running it, to respect my legal rights. If not, I will begin proceedings to revoke the usage rights for any technology being used outside of the original agreement. The room was silent for several seconds. For the first time that morning, the composure on Isabella's face genuinely cracked. She was no longer looking at me as a woman confronting the wife of her lover, but as a CFO forced to recalculate a financial strategy that was suddenly at risk. At that moment, the conference room door burst open. Michael walked in. Someone must have called him. He was wearing a navy blue shirt, his tie loosened, his expression as composed as ever, but his eyes were a degree more intense. He looked at me, then at the files on the table. Sarah, what are you doing here? I turned to him, my voice flat. I'm here to remind you that before I was your wife, I was one of the people who built the foundation that made Apex successful. Michael took a step closer. His voice low. Go home, Sarah. We'll talk about this at home. I shook my head. At home, you talk with your mouth. Today, I'm talking with paper. Through the glass door, I could see more people watching. This company ran on price quotes, supply chains, and gossip. A single disturbance in this room was enough to set the entire floor buzzing. Michael pulled out the chair opposite me, his forced calm not quite holding. Don't take this too far. I looked at him. What is too far? Demanding my legal rights? Or reminding you that your wife isn't just someone who cooks your meals? Isabella interjected, her voice much harder than before. If this is brought up now, while the company is in its current operational state, our primary product lines will be affected. You should reconsider. I turned to her, my voice almost gentle. I have considered it very carefully. It is precisely because the primary product lines will be affected that I chose to sit here today before filing any official papers. Michael fell silent. For the first time, I saw real anxiety in his eyes. Not because I knew who he was sleeping with, but because I had just touched the very thing that had sustained his position for years. 15 minutes later, Arthur Jenkins was called in. He was a major shareholder and an influential voice among the older family members. He walked in, surveyed the tense room, and asked, "What's going on here?" I stood up, polite but firm. "Uncle Arthur. I just wanted to make you aware that some of the core technology the company is using is legally registered to me. If my rights continue to be ignored, I will have no choice but to take appropriate legal action." Arthur took the files and scanned them, his eyes narrowing. A man like him saw the world through the lens of profit, and profit doesn't side with sentiment or morality, it sides with whoever is holding the stronger hand. After only a few minutes, his demeanor changed. He turned to Michael, his voice low but heavy. "You need to fix this, Michael. Now." I saw Michael's hand clench on the tabletop. Isabella sat motionless, her expression no longer so smooth. I gathered my papers, stood up, and straightened my blazer. I didn't come here to destroy anything. I came to remind everyone that just because something has been ignored for a long time doesn't mean it doesn't exist. With that, I walked out of the conference room. As I passed through the open-plan office, I could feel the gazes that followed me were different from the morning's. It was no longer the curiosity of watching a wife's drama unfold, but a look of wary respect. I walked through the lobby and out the front doors into the winter wind. And for the first time in many years, I felt like I had walked out of a place that had treated me like a shadow, finally wearing the form of a person with a name, a stake, and the power to give them sleepless nights. 2 days after I left Apex Materials with my files, David called me just before noon. His voice was lower and more clipped than usual. "Are you free? There's a strange money trail." I was in the kitchen, washing a bunch of kale. At his words, my hand stopped. "Where?" "Not over the phone. Let's meet." That afternoon, I went to a small cafe near a quiet reservoir. The early winter sky was overcast, and a cold wind skimmed across the gray water. I chose a table in the back. David arrived with a manila envelope and a printed bank statement with several lines highlighted. As soon as I looked at it, I saw the transfers were from a secondary account managed by Michael. The amounts varied, but the payments were monthly, $3,800 one month, $4,500 the next, sometimes jumping to nearly $6,000. The recipient wasn't an individual, but a hospital in West Virginia. I looked up. "Hospital bills." David nodded. I dug a little deeper. "The patient file is for an 8-year-old boy named Leo Miller." Hearing that, my chest tightened. The child's name, his age, the regular payments from Michael, my mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. I'm no saint. My first thought wasn't charitable. It was a single, humiliating word. His son. My voice was stiff when I asked, "What about the mother?" David shook his head. "Very little information on the next of kin. Just an elderly woman who cares for him and a man who occasionally comes from out of state to pay the bills. I don't have a clear photo of him at the hospital yet, but the money trail is solid." I held the statement, the numbers blurring and refocusing before my eyes. If it was true, then I hadn't just been betrayed with women and money. I had been living a lie where, on the surface, I was his wife, while behind my back, he had a whole other branch of his life growing. A bitter taste filled my mouth. David watched me for a moment. "Do you want me to keep going on my own?" I shook my head immediately. "No. This is something I have to see for myself." That evening, I cooked dinner, set the table, and listened to Eleanor talk about an upcoming family event. Michael was there, his appearance as composed as ever. The only difference was that since my visit to the office, he had started watching me more closely. He'd make casual remarks, like, "You seem to be going out a lot lately." I would just reply, "Staying home all the time gets old." He would study me, but he couldn't read anything. The next morning, I told Eleanor that an old friend in West Virginia needed help with some property paperwork, and I'd use the trip to visit. She was skeptical, but saw I was determined, so she just said to come back quickly, as things at home were complicated enough. I nodded without further explanation. The more you talk, the more you risk revealing. And at this stage, I didn't want anyone to know what I was chasing. The bus ride from Boston to the small town in West Virginia took most of the day. The mountain roads twisted and turned, fog clinging to the hillsides. I sat by the window, watching the rugged landscape roll by, my heart heavy. There are journeys no one wants to take, but you must, because without seeing the truth for yourself, you remain trapped in painful and sordid speculation. The county hospital was a dated, yellow brick building on a gentle slope. The hallways were wide but cold, smelling of antiseptic, bland soup, and the damp coats of visiting family members. I found the pediatric oncology ward. The children there were all so small and pale. Some wore masks, some had shaved heads, some sat attached to IV drips, their eyes distant. Just walking through the ward was heartbreaking. I stopped in front of the room number David had given me. A boy was lying on his side, incredibly thin, his skin sallow, his hair sparse from treatments. Beside him, a woman in her 60s was peeling an apple with a small, dull knife. I asked softly, "Excuse me, is this Leo's bed?" The woman looked up, her eyes clouded with age, but still sharp. "It is. Are you a friend?" I clutched my purse strap. "I'm visiting from out of state. Someone asked me to check in on him." She invited me to sit on the plastic chair next to the bed. The boy turned to look at me. He had large, clear eyes that held a sadness beyond his years. I had come all this way braced for a new level of humiliation, but standing before this child, my anger receded. He was too fragile to be a target for an adult's rage. I leaned down and asked gently, "Are you Leo?" He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, ma'am. Can you eat apples?" He glanced at the apple his grandmother was peeling and gave a tiny smile. "A little bit." That small smile tightened my chest. A moment later, the old woman began to talk. Leo had a blood disorder and had been in and out of hospitals for years. A young woman had dropped him off in a hurry years ago and never returned. The woman, his great-aunt, had been caring for him ever since. A man from out of state would come by occasionally to pay the bills, ask a few questions, and then leave. He never stayed long, and never identified himself as the father. I listened, my mind racing. He didn't claim to be the father but consistently sent money. He didn't abandon the boy but didn't truly enter his life either. It sounded exactly like Michael's way of operating, just enough responsibility to appease his conscience, but not enough commitment to be truly present. As I was thinking, Leo looked up at me. "Ma'am, are you really from Boston?" I nodded. "Yes, I am." He studied me for a moment and then said something that made the air leave my lungs. "You look like someone in my grandma's pictures." I froze. "What pictures?" The great-aunt overheard and reached into a worn cloth bag hanging from the bedpost. She pulled out a faded envelope containing a few old photographs. I took them, and my heart hammered as I saw the first one. It was a group of people at a construction site. In the corner, a man in a hard hat was smiling kindly. It was my father. My hand went cold. I flipped to the next photo. A younger woman who looked faintly like me was sitting at a table with a few local workers. It was my mother. My vision blurred. The hospital room, the sounds of coughing children, the squeak of a gurney in the hall, it all faded away. I looked up at Leo again. His nose, the shape of his eyes, there was something familiar about him, a familiarity that traced back to my mother's side of the family. A chill ran down my spine. This boy might not be Michael's son after all. But if not, why was Michael secretly paying his bills? And why were pictures of my parents in an old envelope at his bedside? I sat there for a long time, speechless. The anger I had brought with me had veered onto a different path, one that was quieter but far more terrifying. This was no longer just a story of betrayal. It was an old, tangled chain connecting my own family, a sick child in West Virginia, and the man I called my husband. Before I left, I tucked the blanket around Leo. He looked at me and asked, "Will you come back?" I paused, looking into his clear eyes. For the first time in months of feeling only my own pain, I felt my heart soften in a new way. "Yes," I said. "I'll be back." Leaving the ward, the mountain air hit me like a physical blow. I stood in the hospital parking lot for a long time, then took out my phone and called David. When he answered, I said only one thing. "Pull up everything on that old West Virginia project for me. Start from the beginning." I got back to Boston late that night. The city was lit up, traffic was heavy, and life was moving on as usual. But my mind was replaying the image of Leo's pale face and the faded photos in the envelope. I walked into the house to Eleanor's questioning voice. "What took you so long?" I just said the traffic was bad and went straight to my room, not wanting to speak another word. Michael wasn't home yet. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the photos I had quickly taken at the hospital. My father at the construction site, his kind smile just as I remembered it. My mother, so much younger than my final memories of her. I stared at them until my eyes ached, but I couldn't understand the connection. The next morning, David sent me a link to a secure, password-protected folder. His message was one line. "Read this alone, then call me." I closed my bedroom door, drew the curtains, and opened my laptop. The first file was about Apex's warehouse and material processing facility project in West Virginia, nearly 10 years ago. At the time, my father was working as an independent supervising engineer for the technical consulting firm. I remembered that year, he was away for months at a time. Then one day, we got the call. He had died when a scaffolding collapsed during a site inspection. All my life, I had believed it was a tragic workplace accident. Painful, but a risk of the job. But what I saw on the screen now made my blood run cold. Material comparison reports showed that several batches of load-bearing steel beams and anchor bolts were recorded as high-grade standard, but handwritten notes on the actual delivery slips indicated they had been swapped for cheaper alternatives. There was a safety report with an altered date. There was an internal email mentioning cutting corners on secondary structures to optimize costs. And most damningly, there was a statement from a former worker, which David had unearthed from local civil records. The man stated that on the day of the accident, the scaffolding had been visibly unstable, but his recommendation to halt the inspection was overruled by a superior rushing to meet a deadline. I sat frozen in front of the screen. If these documents were real, then my father's death was not an accident. It was linked to corner cutting, to fraud, to people who valued profit over human lives. My hands rested on the desk, but I could feel them trembling. All my life, I had carried the grief of losing my father as a cruel twist of fate. Now, I was being shown that fate hadn't been cruel, people had. The second file was even more shocking. About 8 months after my father's death, my mother had quietly filed a complaint with a local authority, attaching a few copies of the material invoices. The complaint went nowhere, it was dismissed for insufficient evidence. Not long after, my mother was killed in a hit-and-run near the bus station. At the time, everyone said our family was cursed. I had cried myself into exhaustion, consumed by funerals, paperwork, and my own grief. I had never once considered that my mother's death might be connected to the same dark cloud that had taken my father. I called David as soon as I finished reading. He answered immediately. I got straight to the point. You think the two deaths are related? There was a pause on the other end, then David spoke slowly. I can't conclude that, but the timing, the documents, and the people involved in that project were all dirty. There's one more thing. The Apex employee who coordinated with your father on that project was from Michael's family. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. Who was it? It wasn't Michael on paper. He wasn't in his current position yet. But he was in West Virginia a lot in the period after your father's accident. My throat closed up. Old memories flooded back, memories I had always cherished as a gentle twist of fate. After my mother died, it was Michael who had appeared at just the right time. He helped me with the paperwork, drove me where I needed to go, and supported me when I was completely lost. At the time, I saw it as kindness from a decent, caring man. From that comfort, we grew closer, fell in love, and got married. I thought he was the lifeline thrown to me when I was drowning. Now, thinking back, a chill washed over me. That evening, Michael came home as usual. He took off his watch, washed his hands, and asked Eleanor about her medication. He asked me why I was eating so little. Every gesture was that of a concerned husband. I watched him, feeling like I was looking at a human skin draped over something I couldn't yet see. For the first time, I dared to consider a possibility, so horrifying I had never let it form. What if this marriage was a lie from the very beginning? What if the man who rescued me in my darkest hour was also doing something else, placating me, controlling me, ensuring that nothing from the past would ever ignite? Late that night, when the house was asleep, I went downstairs to the living room mantelpiece where we kept photos of our families. The scent of a nearby candle hung in the air. I picked up the framed photo of my parents and stared at it for a long time. The pain of my husband's infidelity was now a distant ache. A new, colder feeling was growing inside me, the chill of someone who has just realized they may have spent years in a marriage built on a foundation of secrets and manipulation. I clasped my hands together, my lips moving silently. If what I'm uncovering is true, then this time, I can't close my eyes anymore. I knew then, that my fight with Michael was no longer about saving or leaving a marriage. It was about striking a match to see what had been buried in the ashes of the past. That night, a torrential rain fell over Boston, drumming against the roof and rattling the windows. I was in the kitchen, a stack of files still on the table, when I heard the side door open and slam shut. A moment later, Kevin appeared in the doorway. He was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes bloodshot from alcohol and lack of sleep. But unlike the past few days, he wasn't staggering. His drunkenness seemed like a thin veil for his shame. Seeing me, he froze, then pulled out a chair and sat across from me. We were silent for a moment, the only sound the rain against the glass. I got up and poured him a glass of warm water. He looked at it, steam rising, and gave a harsh laugh. You can still do this for me? I set the glass down. You can either drink it or not. He bowed his head, his hands wrapped around the glass. I thought you would hate me forever. I sat back down and looked at him. I hate people who know what they're doing and do it anyway. You? I'm not sure which category you fall into yet. His head snapped up, his eyes red and circled with dark rings. He swallowed hard, then spoke, each word scraping his throat. I've lost everything, Sarah. I didn't reply. I waited. He propped his elbows on the table and buried his face in his hands. I can't defend anyone anymore. I can't even lie to myself. Growing up in this house, I was always in Michael's shadow. Mom loved him more, trusted him more. It was always your brother is so smart, while I was the hot-headed one who messed things up. He let out a wet, broken laugh. I used to think, fine, I'm the dumber one. But now I know, sometimes you're in the shadows because someone is deliberately standing over you. I listened, my heart not softening, but the sharp edges of my anger blunted. Kevin's fault was weakness, blindness, a life lived on the inertia of dependence. But that was different from Michael's fault. One man actively dug the pit, the other just stood so close to the edge for so long that he didn't realize he was covered in mud. I asked him directly, what do you know? He looked up. Not everything. But some things I'm afraid to even think about anymore. Tell me. He took a breath. For years, in procurement, Michael would give me papers to sign, saying it was just internal procedure to speed things up. Once, I noticed the quantity on an invoice didn't match the actual inventory. I asked him about it, and he snapped, just sign it, I'll handle the rest. So I signed. Kevin slammed his fist on the table, the water in the glass sloshing over the rim. I was so stupid. I thought it was just some creative accounting. Who knew? Who knew what? Kevin looked at me. His lip trembling. About a year ago, I overheard Michael and Isabella arguing in his office. They didn't know I was in the supply closet next door. I heard them mention the West Virginia file and that the old story can't come out. Isabella said if they didn't handle it, it could take them all down. Michael shot back that she just needed to manage the numbers, and what was buried should stay buried. My hand went cold. Kevin continued, his voice dropping. At the time, I thought it was just some old tax issue. I didn't dare think further. But after the hospital, and seeing you at the office, seeing Michael start to panic and Isabella secretly deleting files, I knew something was very wrong. Deleting files? I asked urgently. Kevin nodded. 2 days ago, I went back to the office late to get something. I saw a light on in the finance department. Isabella was still there, her door slightly ajar. I saw her plugging an external hard drive into her computer, talking on the phone, saying she had to clean up before anyone else gets a look. I just stood there, frozen. A minute later, she came out and locked her office and the filing cabinets. I sat in silence, the puzzle pieces sliding into place. Michael was getting nervous, Isabella was covering her tracks, and Kevin was finally pushed to a point where he could no longer pretend to be blind. Outside, the rain poured down. Inside, the kitchen was lit by a single yellow light, illuminating the haggard face of my brother-in-law. For the first time, I saw him not as an entitled man-child, but as someone small and broken. I asked, why are you telling me this? Kevin sat up straighter. His voice raspy, but clear. To tell the truth. And to ask you, if I tell everything now, is it too late? I looked at him for a long time. Too late for what? To save yourself, or to save your conscience? A twisted smile crossed his face. Probably can't save much. But I don't want to be buried with them. Hearing that, something shifted inside me. It wasn't pity, but the recognition that he had finally learned to fear the right thing. I took out my phone and called Rob Miller. It was late, but he answered. After I explained the situation, he was silent for a moment, then said, separate the cases. One is the divorce, based on infidelity and emotional distress. The other is financial misconduct, the old West Virginia files, and criminal liability. Don't let them bleed into each other emotionally. I put the phone on speaker. Rob asked, is Kevin willing to give a sworn statement? Kevin, hearing him, pursed his lips and then spoke directly to the phone. I am. Rob's instructions were concise. From now on, don't sign anything. Don't touch anything at the office. Write down everything you remember. Dates, who said what, which papers you signed, what you overheard. The more specific, the better. The call ended. I pushed a notebook and a pen across the table to Kevin. He stared at them, then picked up the pen. His hand was shaking, not from the alcohol, but because for the first time in his life, He was about to do something that went against the entire orbit of his family. Tell the truth about his brother. After a few lines, he paused and looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot, but no longer evasive. Sarah? Yes? He took a deep, shuddering breath, his voice cracking but firming at the end. I've lost everything. The only thing I have left is the truth. I didn't answer. I just watched him bend his head and continue to write, the sound of the pen scratching on paper mixing with the rain outside. Sometimes, a family doesn't collapse with a scream. It collapses with the quiet sound of a pen, when its members finally stop covering for one another. The meeting took place on a cold, gray afternoon in the main conference room at Apex Materials. It had been called by Arthur Jenkins, under the official guise of a review of executive operations and risk assessment. But everyone who walked into that room knew it was a reckoning. Present were myself, Michael, Kevin, Eleanor, Isabella Rossi, Arthur, 2 other major shareholders, and Rob Miller, as my legal counsel. The tension was so thick that the sound of a chair scraping the floor was jarring. Michael sat at the head of the table, his usual spot, looking composed in a white shirt and dark tie. Isabella was at his right, her laptop open, her makeup flawless, her expression cool. Eleanor sat slightly apart, clutching her purse like a life raft. Kevin sat across from his brother, his eyes red, jaw clenched, staring at the table. Arthur began, his voice heavy. Today, we speak plainly. Anyone who tries to sidestep the truth is only making it harder on themselves. Rob nodded and placed a thick binder in the center of the table. We will proceed by category of evidence. The first is personal conduct. He laid out the hospital records, photos of Michael and Isabella at the condo, and bank statements. The room was silent. Eleanor turned away at the sight of Chloe's name. Isabella remained impassive. Michael spoke first. Personal matters don't belong in a corporate meeting. Rob replied, if they were only personal, we wouldn't be here. But these relationships are entangled with company expenditures and directly impact stakeholder interests. The second category is financial. The spreadsheet appeared on the large screen. Inflated contracts, shell companies, cash withdrawals, Michael's approvals, Isabella's sign-offs, Kevin's signatures on receipts. A shareholder at the end of the table swore under his breath. Arthur's face grew darker as he looked at the numbers. He slammed his hand on the table. You call this a clerical error? Michael leaned back, his voice low. These figures need to be audited. I don't approve every line item. Isabella immediately added, my sign-offs are based on executive-approved proposals. Any error must be traced to the source. Michael shot her a look, and in that one glance, I saw their alliance crumble. Just then, Kevin spoke, his voice quiet but sharp. Stop blaming everyone else, Michael. All eyes turned to him. He pulled out the notebook he had filled and placed it on the table. I signed those inventory forms on your orders. I questioned the numbers once, and you told me to just sign. I heard you and Isabella arguing about the West Virginia file. Eleanor gasped. Kevin, do you know what you're saying? Kevin turned to his mother, a bitter, tearful smile on his face. I do, Mom. For the first time in my life, I know exactly what I'm saying. He then looked directly at his brother. You slept with my wife, you used me to sign your dirty papers, and now you're going to throw me under the bus to save yourself? For the first time, Michael's composure shattered. He shot to his feet. You shut up. You're drunk. Kevin stood up too, his chair screeching back. I've been sober ever since I lost my dignity, Michael. Arthur yelled for them to sit down. Rob used the moment to present the final set of documents. The West Virginia project. The workers' statement, the material discrepancies, my mother's old complaint, and a timeline showing Michael's sudden appearance in my life after my parents' deaths. Rob spoke slowly. We are not drawing criminal conclusions here. But there is sufficient grounds to question a cover-up of past malfeasance and the subsequent suppression of records for years. At this, Michael lost all pretense of calm. He looked from me to Rob, his eyes blazing with fury. This is all speculation. A bunch of old papers and hearsay. He pointed a finger at me. And you? What do you know about this company? A housewife who's been home for years thinks she can waltz in here and understand anything? The room fell silent. Months ago, his words would have crushed me. But that day, I only felt a cold resolve. I stood up and pulled my technical files towards me. You're right. I was at home. I spoke slowly. But the core technology patents, the specs for the paint that won you your biggest contracts, the waterproofing solutions. My hands were on all of them. I was a fool once for trusting you, but I won't be a fool for the rest of my life. I took a step forward, my voice steady. You thought because I stepped back, I lost my value. You thought because I was quiet, I was ignorant. You were wrong. People are silent sometimes because they want to leave a door open. But you slammed every door shut yourself. Michael stared at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not the fear of a husband caught cheating, but the fear of a man seeing something he had long dismissed rise up and claim its name. The meeting ended with Arthur Jenkins making 3 immediate decisions. Michael's executive authority was suspended, a special forensic audit was to begin immediately, and all financial data was to be sealed. Isabella sat frozen, her face pale. Eleanor slumped in her chair, looking as if she had just watched her fortress crumble. And I stood there, amidst the smell of paper and fear, and understood that the masks had finally come off for good. In the weeks that followed, the foundation of Apex Materials crumbled. The forensic audit uncovered a web of fraud more extensive than we had imagined. Michael was officially removed from his position. Facing legal action, Isabella quickly turned, offering testimony in exchange for a plea deal. Chloe remained at her mother's house, a pariah in the family. Kevin, having chosen to testify, began to pull his life back together. He stopped drinking, and while he was thinner, his eyes were clearer. One day, he told me, "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Sarah. I just want you to know I won't hide anything anymore." I told him that living an honest life from now on was better than any apology. Eleanor was a broken woman. The matriarch who had built her life on a foundation of appearances had to watch it all fall apart. One afternoon, she called me into her room, her eyes sunken. I was wrong, wasn't I, Sarah? The question came too late, but it still carried a sting. I replied, "Some mistakes aren't about a single moment, Mom. They're about loving one person so much that you let everyone else make the sacrifices." For the first time, I saw her cry, not for what others would think, but for the truth she could no longer deny. I filed for divorce. The legal battle was messy, but my case was strong. The papers outlining the financial crimes and the evidence surrounding the West Virginia project were turned over to the authorities. The investigation into my parents' deaths was reopened. A month later, I went back to West Virginia. Leo was sitting up in bed, looking a bit stronger. When he saw me, he smiled. "You really came back." I sat with him, peeling an orange, listening to his great-aunt tell me he had been eating better. Looking at him, I no longer saw a symbol of betrayal. I saw a child, an innocent victim of adult deceptions. And in that, I found a measure of peace, a way to keep from being consumed by my own anger. On my way home, I stopped at the small hillside cemetery where my parents were buried. The spring wind whispered through the grass. I laid a small bouquet of white roses and stood before their headstones for a long time. I used to think my life was a story of tragedy, followed by luck. Now I knew that fortune isn't about the hand that's offered to you, but whether that hand is truly lifting you up, or just guiding you into a more beautiful cage. I clasped my hands and whispered, "I'm not living in the dark anymore. I'll walk the rest of the way myself." From a woman who once stood in her kitchen watching a pot of soup simmer, telling herself to endure for the sake of a peaceful home, I had walked a long and painful road. I learned that submission does not preserve a home, it only nourishes the rot within. And justice, if you don't stand up and demand it, is rarely served. My greatest lesson was this. In a marriage, love for another is essential, but never love them so much that you lose your own voice. And never, for the fear of what others woo, because a lie. Because a lie that is fed by silence will only grow, until one day, it devours you whole.